talking about hope that we see, resurrection, living hope that we see all the way through the Bible, not just Jesus' resurrection, which we're building towards as we come closer to Easter Sunday, aren't we? But we're talking, we can see it. This is a pattern. This is God's character. This is God, what God does. This is his action in the world ever since he created us. He's been resurrecting dead things all the way through. So, God is a God who brings dead things back to life. That's why we have confidence this morning in praying for those that are not well. Sickness is a type of death in our bodies. It restricts us. It takes away life. And so we can be confident to bring the sick before Jesus and ask for him to heal them and meet them because he's a restorer. He's a resurrector. That's who he is. In the Bible, when the word death is used, it refers to so much more than a physical death in our bodies. But it encompasses whatever inhibits, sickness inhibits, doesn't it? Whatever harms or destroys life. And therefore, whenever we read about God's power restoring, healing, bringing freedom, or raising back to life, we're reading about the power of life overcoming the forces of death. And that's what we're talking about. So far, we've looked at how the God of life has been triumphing over death ever since death first came into the world back in Genesis. You might remember our focus on the first week was Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, and how Abraham's faith was strong because he'd already seen God overcome death by allowing Sarah, enabling a barren woman to have a child. So he was able to trust him with the sacrifice he was called to bring Isaac. Do you remember this? And God overcame death twice, which is great. So far we've seen he's been the disruptor of death throughout the books of the prophets. Hannah being healed of her barrenness, Elijah, Elisha, they're the first resurrection stories of physical resurrection that we see in the Bible. And even Elisha's dry bones, I love that story, where this guy just gets thrown into a pit and he touches the bones and boom, back to life. I mean, I just love the image that creates. I don't know whether it's accurate, the image that comes in my mind, but I just think it's great. It's like the cartoon, where they kind of walk off the thing, goes back up again, and that's really good. Anyway, we also consider the possibility of corporate resurrection hope. So in the Bible, we see many times the people of God are taken into exile. So they lose their land, they go into exile, and then God restores the whole people back into the promised land, or out of the wilderness into the promised land, into Canaan. And we see that so many times as well, corporate resurrection. And we even looked at Ezekiel 37, the valley of the dry bones, didn't we? And how God's saying, prophesy to the dry bones, raise up the people of God. And we had a prophetic word about that we're still waiting to see as well come through. So, throughout the books of the prophets, God speaks and brings to birth a sure and certain hope, a living hope, because the power of God is stronger than death. So this week, there's your little recap. If you missed anything, you can always whip back on YouTube and you'll find them. This week, we're going to be focusing on identifying living hope in the books of the Bible referred to as the writings. So that includes, now see how long this preach is going to be. That includes Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1 and 2 Chronicles, basically the rest of the Old Testament. So I hope your dinner's been set for tea time because we're going to be, no. This is a big undertaking, but what we'll see today, and we'll just have to pick and choose our bits like we have so far, is this continued pattern of God's building on living hope. We just see a build-up of it. We just keep seeing more and more of it. Just keeps showing us. If you see a character trait in someone and then it just keeps going over and over time, eventually you don't just say, oh, sometimes Helen's generous. It changes to Helen's a generous person. Do you get that? So if there's a character that you see once, so Helen says to me, Hayley, I'm going to get the coffee today. I'm like, oh, that's nice. Helen's a generous person. And then we keep doing things. She says, I'm going to give you some time today. I'm going to lend you my skill here, and I'm going to do something with some skill I've got, and I'm going to do this. And in the end, you end up with this understanding that Helen, I'm picking on Helen because she won't mind. Helen is a generous person. That's her character trait. That is what she does. That's who she is. This is what we see with God. We see God do the same stuff over and over and over and over again throughout the Bible. We're just looking at resurrection hope today, but there's so many characteristics of God that we see over and over and over again. And that's why we're confident when we say God's a way maker, he's a promise keeper, he's light in the darkness, he's whatever the other one is. Anyway, that's who he is. Because he just keeps doing it over and over and over and over again. These books, I think, perhaps contain some of the most dramatic pictures and prophecies of resurrection hope. So here we go. Pin back your ears. We're off. Throughout the Psalms, there's so many words that talk about threats of death, aren't they? There's so much like I'm in the pit of despair and all of those kind of words. There's also lots of thanksgiving that God's the rescuer from those places, from all that tries to thwart God's plan. God is the rescuer for us as individuals and for us as God's people. We see it individual, we see it corporate. There's also often an acknowledgement that after our time on earth here is through, there's the hope of a future resurrection to be with God forever. The Psalms contain all of that over and over and over again. So as one example, because we haven't got loads of time, and there's so many, in Psalm 73, 23 to 26, Asaph writes these words, "Yet I am always with you. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, and afterward you will take me into glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My heart and my flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." Here, Asaph's saying he's been guided and directed by God in this life. That's his pattern. That's what he's seen God do over and over again. He's been faithful to him. So he talks about that. But then he says, but even after this life, his confidence is that death will not overthrow his connection with God. Death is not going to split that connection that he's known in this life. It's just going to continue. God will bring him from this life into glory. He's going to stay with God. Interestingly, that word take, when Asaph says, afterwards you will take me into glory, is actually the same Hebrew word that's used when Enoch is taken to be with God. And also when Elijah is taken as well. It's the same Hebrew word that is used. So it rescued from death. That's what it is. Do you remember Enoch was that whole, and then he died, and then he died. And then Enoch says, and then he was taken. Like he was taken and spared actual experience of that death. N.T. Wright notes that Asaph discovers that he's grasped by a love that will not let him go, a power that death and the dissolution of the body cannot thwart. What can death do? We heard last week, didn't we? Where, O death, is your sting? This is a power that the dissolution of the body cannot thwart. We have a hope that is certain and sure. This same discovery is for us too, as followers of Christ, to realize that as we walk this earth with all the challenges we face, God walks with us. He holds our hands the same way hundreds of thousands of years ago he was doing it to Asaph. And his grasp is stronger than death. His hold continues after our last breath, and our living hope is that he'll take us into resurrection glory, being united to Christ. This is the living hope that we have. Just take a minute and let that settle, because we can rush through some of this stuff. But actually, let's maybe give thanks to God that this hope is ours, that death cannot thwart our relationship, our connection with God. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. Moving beyond Psalms for the sake of time, the book of Job. Everyone love that one? Maybe not a favourite. Tells a story of someone who suffers so much tragic loss and suffering. He knows death all around him. I don't think there's a clearer picture in the Bible of someone so absolutely surrounded on every side with death. But by the end of the story, God's restorative work is also very clear, conquering the forces of death that had been much of his life story. His friends tried to blame him for this huge downfall. But they were wrong, because in the end, we see God's transformational restoration of his circumstances as a removal of blame and a reward for his trust in God. He held on. God held his hand. He had a grasp of his hand throughout when all death was surrounding him, and he brought him through it and found restoration and repayment. Just the words that are used in Job at the end are just quite amazing at how much was restored to him. So, we're not just going to dive through each book. I'm going to just do a deeper look now at the book of Ruth. And in a similar pattern to Job's story, I love the transformation from being surrounded by death and hopelessness that we see at the beginning, being restored to family and purpose that we see in Ruth and Naomi's story. So listen to how it begins, Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they'd lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. That's a picture of death, isn't it? She's moved out from the land she knows. She's gone into a foreign land because there was food, because there was a famine where she was. And then while she's there, so she won't have any other family that lived there, while she's there, her husband dies, her sons get married, and then both her sons die. And she's left. She's got these daughters-in-law, but that's all she's got left of people around her. So there's a famine. That's pretty miserable, isn't it? That's pretty much death. You don't get food, you're going to really struggle. And then all the bereavement and all of this stuff. But also, not only is the death of the husband and the 2 sons, think about when we've talked about genealogies in the last 2 weeks and the family line. The 2 sons had both died. The daughters-in-law hadn't yet had any children. That was the end, a potential end of their family line. The family line that actually led to King David. That was looked like the end of that. Loss, grief, loneliness in a foreign land, poverty. You don't get much more dire. But the more dire the circumstances, the more noticeable the deliverance. Let's follow the story. Naomi then hears that there's now food back in Bethlehem, where the family originally came from. So she decides to move back. Her daughters-in-law decide to go with her to a country that they've never known. So in the same way that Naomi and her husband and family moved to a land they didn't know, now these daughters-in-law are saying, we'll come back with you, and they don't know anybody there. The daughters-in-law decide this, but Naomi releases them from this obligation. She obviously recognizes that actually your people are here, and I've not got anyone else to marry you. I've got no more children. Orpah eventually agrees to stay in Moab, but Ruth's determined to stay with Naomi as the story goes. Naomi and Ruth arrive back in Bethlehem without anywhere to live or any source of income or food. There wasn't like any kind of benefits available. There wasn't a backup plan. There was no food bank. There was nothing. They had nothing. But we're told that it's the start of the barley harvest. Ruth goes to the fields to collect any leftover grain. Remember this law of gleaning that we talked about a while ago? We talked about the law of the Sabbath and the law of the tithe, the law of the gleaning, which was part of the way that God was helping them when they came out of captivity, to help the poor and the foreigner, to leave a little bit of stuff around the edge of the fields for others to collect, if you remember that. So for the sake of time, we skip a bit to where Boaz eventually, who owned the field that Ruth went to, and they eventually get married. You'll have to read the book. It's not that long. So she gleans in the field of Boaz. He marries her because he turns out to be a relative of Naomi's husband. They call it a kinsman redeemer in the time, which is basically someone who's got a legal obligation to redeem a relative in serious difficulty. And they would have been in serious difficulty with no way of being provided for. So in chapter 4, whizzing through, they get married, and then they have a son. And he's called Obed. Let's read these words. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." What began as a story of death is transformed into a story of life. So not only has Naomi got family now restored to her, she's now got a grandchild. She's got someone else. The family line's able to be continued. That family line, which is really, really crucial, because Boaz has this son called Obed, and Obed's son Jesse just happens to turn out to be David's father. So that line that was planned, God has brought restoration to the powers of death that tried to thwart God's plan and purposes, and then it gets restored, and now God's plan, which was always there, which God makes happen, he's overcome the force of death to bring back the family line, and we've now got it back restored again. How good's that? Out of death and hopelessness, life has come. Esther is another amazing story where the Jews living in Persia were living under the threat of death. Esther was in the right place at the right time, but her assignment to go to the king to intervene on the behalf of the Jews, was not without risk. If someone in that time went without being invited to the king could just put you to death. That was the rule. That was the culture that they lived in. And so she was absolutely taking her life into her hands. The forces of death were surrounding her as she went to do this. But after the Jewish people and Esther and her attendants fast for, anyone remember? 3 days. Oh, there's 3 days again. 3 days after that, Esther approaches the king's court. Her acceptance by the king, and therefore the potential threat of death for approaching the king's court without invitation, was yet another deliverance from death on the 3rd day. If you read the whole story, you'll see that Esther's deliverance from death and the events that followed led to the deliverance from death for all the Jews living in Persia. It was massive, massive. We see the pattern of God reversing situations and circumstances throughout the Bible. He turns darkness into light. He turns death into life. He turns sickness into healing, destruction into restoration. And reversal is also a key theme in the book of Esther. Mordecai, who was despised by Haman because he wouldn't bow before him, ended up honored by Haman. Haman had to do the honoring, actually putting him on the horse and giving him the robe. It was complete reversal of circumstances. Haman, who sought to kill the Jews and thought he was going to prosper, he ended up dead. Reversal. Esther, who knew going to the king uninvited could lead to her death, was spared. And the plot against the Jews, which involved the threat of death hanging over them wherever they lived, collapsed. Once again, we're reminded that the forces of death are no match for the God of life. We can't leave the Old Testament writings when we're tracking the stories and principles of life triumphing over death without considering the book of Daniel. And this is just, do you see how I'm telling you? This is building. This is building. The examples of life over death are just building as we go through. The setting of events in Daniel is God's people in exile. They've been exiled to Babylon, so that's like a death. They no longer can live, they no longer can worship freely, they no longer can be in their land. They're now under control of a foreign culture, a pagan culture, living under pagan rule in a completely alien culture. This is like death to them, this exile. And one of the most famous passages in chapter 3 is where 3 very brave Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and a bungalow. My shack, your shack, and a bungalow. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you want to be correct, they're the names, refused to bow to the foreign gods of Babylon, which led to their punishment of being thrown into a furnace. Like it wasn't like, we're just not going to worship you. All right, that's all right, don't worry about it. No, this was like taking death into their own hands. This was like, we're now at your mercy, God. What are you going to do about this? Let's read from verse 16 because it's so good. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. That's the worshipping of foreign gods. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, just like that, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Whoa. God's power over the forces of death is the only explanation for this miraculous outcome. It's the only explanation. And in the next verse, we even see King Nebuchadnezzar praising God. I mean, like, reversal. Like, this situation comes because these people who followed the God Almighty wouldn't bow to him. And then this happens miraculously because God is greater than even the force of this fiery furnace, which was pretty hot if it killed the people who were taking them up there. And in the end, Nebuchadnezzar not just only lets them go, but he ends up worshipping the God that he was condemning them in the first place for worshipping. Reversal. Their bodies should have perished, but the God of life overcame the power of death. In chapter 6, God then overcomes the power of death again, this time involving the Babylonian king Darius, Daniel, and the den of lions. Daniel was enclosed in a situation that naturally could only have resulted in physical death. But because Daniel also trusted the God of life, no kind of harm or wound was found on him either. In both these stories, rather than the phenomenons of life after death, we actually see the clear triumph of life over death. So it wasn't just that they died and then they were raised to life again. I mean, that says just. That's quite impressive, isn't it? But actually, the whole realm of death was just circumvented. Like, they just were in the situation of death, where death should have come, and God, the power of God, overcame the power of death, that they didn't have to die and then be risen again, but they just carried on living with no singe to them, with no heat stroke, with no burning, with no bite marks, not even a scratch off the lions. The deliverance of Daniel from the lion's den is a very clear picture of resurrection. The den was intended to become Daniel's tomb. He was shut away in a tomb. He was put in the den. A stone was put over the entrance. He was expected to die in there. That was supposed to be his tomb. What happened instead? Daniel walked out the next morning. Daniel's end was to come in the den, but Daniel walked out unscathed. This rescue anticipates our own deliverance from death. We will be raised from death without harm or corruption. Our God, the same all-powerful God of Abraham, of Elijah, of Job, of Daniel, of Esther, will rescue us too from the forces of death. Death has no hold over us. I'm running out of time, but a quick mention of Daniel 12, 2-3 seems important to read right now. Daniel 12 says this: multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. One of my study Bibles considers this to be the clearest teaching in the Old Testament on physical resurrection and what will happen to the righteous, those who have accepted Jesus' redeeming sacrifice that we celebrated this morning and remembered on the cross. And the wicked, those who've rejected Jesus or failed to believe in his life-saving work on the cross and to receive that, the benefit of that, there's a different outcome. This is very clear in Scripture. We can't make this sound nice. Maybe it seems harsh. Well, it would be harsh if some people were rewarded with life evermore with God and others were excluded merely by chance or whether you're able to meet a certain standard or not. But the wonder of Jesus' sacrifice that we celebrated and remembered this morning is that it is available. The benefits are for all people. Everybody can receive and benefit from his sacrificial gift to us and receive life forevermore. Because by believing in the saving power of Jesus, we're then measured by his righteous standard, not ours. Praise God. Yeah. We take on all of the benefit of what Jesus achieved at the cross for us, and we are then measured by Jesus' righteousness. We stand in his righteousness because of what he's done. Because Jesus is the only way to know forgiveness and abundant life forevermore. His power and his willingness to forgive all people who come to him is like very good news. In fact, it's the best news you'll ever know. The best news ever. That's why we've got to share it. We're pretty selfish if we didn't. We'll just keep this to ourselves. This is the best news you're ever going to hear, but I'm not going to tell you. No, we've got to tell people about this because this is life forevermore. If you haven't yet chosen to trust in Jesus' saving power, which gives life over the forces of death, it's available to everyone today. No one is excluded. All people are invited to take and benefit from what Jesus did on the cross. And to end this morning's sermon, let's just stop by at the last verse of 2 Chronicles, which in the ordering of the Hebrew Bible in Jesus' day would have been the end of the Old Testament. So the way the Hebrew Bible's written from Genesis, the way it's ordered, the last book in the Hebrew Bible is 2 Chronicles. So this is the very last verse of the last book in the Hebrew Old Testament, and we're just coming out of the Old Testament after this week in this series. So this is the last verse, and it seems good as a fitting note of hope to end our 3-session journey of resurrection hope in the Old Testament. The setting is that the people of Judah have been exiled to Babylon. So we heard about that in Daniel. It's a kind of corporate death that we've talked about. And they've been there for around 70 years at this time, but the prophets predicted a corporate resurrection. When you go through like the books of the prophets, you'll see the predictions of corporate resurrection. Babylon had been the place the exiled people had kind of descended to. They'd kind of gone down into exile, into Babylon. Like they're at the bottom of the pile right now. They're not feeling really jolly about things. They're kind of been reduced down. But King Cyrus now proclaims their ascent. So they've descended into exile. And King Cyrus, too many kings, that's 3 this morning. King Cyrus now proclaims their ascent here. Listen to these words. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. So you know about the destruction of the temple, the rebuildings of the temple and stuff. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them. So the Old Testament doesn't end with exile, but with hope, pointing to the future. The rebuilding of the temple is pointing forward to future worship together, back as the people of God, corporately restored. Through Cyrus, God is calling the Israelites back to the land and to the rebuilding of the temple. This is a directive that leads the people from exile to freedom and from death to life, almost like dry bones coming together in a valley. This brings us, you might be pleased, I don't know, to the end of our whistle-stop tour of the Old Testament. The stories of rescue and prayers in the faith in the writings build upon the law and the prophets that we see, stoking the fires of resurrection hope. I hope you can kind of feel it's getting a bit warmer. The fires of resurrection hope are building. They're kind of growing. They're being built one on top of another. The earth will not hold the dead forever. There is a time to live, a time to die, and a time to rise. Both the righteous and the wicked will face God, and those who have chosen to live in the forgiveness and the freedom Jesus bought for all people will know God's everlasting favor. This is the living hope that we have. This is the anchor of our souls. Next week, we move into the New Testament and begin in the Gospels.